That's a great segue into the next thing we're going to talk about, because I looked at the timeline.
Yes.
And I looked at the title that you held as the CFO of how do you pronounce
Bochkarov
brewery. And I was like, well, there's something doesn't add up. People don't get CFO, don't become CFO at 29, really.
Yes.
Was it 29?
They don't usually. Yeah. I mean, the first role I took, so I did KPMG for a couple of years in Moscow, and then I took a job with a client called Credit Suisse First Boston. Yeah. So I worked as the US GAAP financial controller of a major investment bank.
Yeah.
And the things that CSFB were doing at the time were incredible. They were pioneers in fixed income and in equity trading and in investment banking. And I was back office, but I was working with some incredible people. There was a guy called Boris Jordan, Stephen Jennings. Anyone who knows Russia knows that these are two of the figures in 1990s Russian banking and equity trading. So I was working with some incredible people. I went for a while with CSFB to New York. But although Manhattan is an incredible city and I love it to death, and my daughter's about to go and live there, I was dragged back. In 1996, age 28, I was living in one of the best cities in the world, Manhattan, and I just missed Russia. So I came back to St. Petersburg, and it was around that time, and I'm sure you're going to ask me about my first business. I both set up my first business and then for a while worked for Price Waterhouse as an audit manager. But then I got headhunted by a bunch of very interesting entrepreneurs, Icelandic entrepreneurs who'd built a drinks business. And they'd built a factory and they'd launched what's called Alka-Pops. And I don't know if you remember, you weren't really born then in 97, but something called Alka-Pops, which are these horrible fizzy alcoholic drinks. And these Icelandic individuals, Tor and Magnus, had spotted these drinks in the UK and decided, well, we're going to build a factory and launch them in Russia. And they'd made a ton of money doing that. It's very much a fad drink. And one of the drinks was called lemon booze. So it's a lemon tasting vodka-infused drink. I mean, absolutely awful stuff, but Russians seem to like it. And they'd launched this Bravo range of soft drinks and Alka-Pops, and they were doing gin and tonic in a can. They realized that there was no future in that this is very much a fad product. So what they wanted to do, and they came to me and said, Stephen, first of all, we need proper accounts. Secondly, we need to get those accounts audited. Thirdly, we need to write an information memorandum, and we need to go out and raise $25 million to build a brewery. So that was my role. So they approached me when I was 28 years old I was. And at first it was a consulting assignment with no title, but then they realized, no, we need this guy as our group CFO. So I was a CFO, I think I turned 29, but in my 20s.
Yeah.
I mean, if they were looking for a CFO, if their business was based in Iceland or in the UK, they'd be looking at someone 35 to 40. I was there. I was in St. Petersburg. They also liked, and one of the reasons they approached me was that I'd set up a business, a vegetarian cafe bar, the first vegetarian cafe bar restaurant in the former Soviet Union, called appropriately Café Idiot.
Yeah.
Named after the Dostoevsky novel.
I was about to ask if it was Dostoevsky.
Exactly. So I built this cafe on the Moika River. I bought this, or rented for 5 years, this basement, this abandoned basement by the river. And at the time, there was a homeless guy living in there. It was filthy. We renovated it on the cheap. And my budget for this whole project was about $60,000. So for $60,000, I took this completely abandoned basement. We painted it, we tore it apart, we bought old furniture from all over the city, and we created this kind of Dostoevsky feel bohemian cafe in the heart of St. Petersburg. And we served, and I'd just come back from New York. I brought with me a coffee machine almost in my hand luggage, and a juicing machine. And it was very much, we got 6 months to set up this business, limited budget. If you're setting up a restaurant, you can spend $1 million. Or like myself, you could spend $60,000. But that was pretty much what I had. It wasn't such my life savings, but it was half my life savings. Mm. And I created this business.
That sounds like a dream. It's really a dream of me to also open a cafe.
Do you know what? It's everyone's dream.
Until you actually do it?
Yes, until you actually do it. I mean, my budget initially was like $30,000 in 3 months.
Doubled everything.
Correct. Double everything.
Yeah.
The reality was $60,000 in 6 months. And at one point, we just thought what held us up was the licenses.
Yeah.
And there's a funny story. There was a lady. There's something called Sanepidstatia. Anyway, it's one of the bureaus in Russia where you need to get a stamp. It's a sanitation committee,
Right.
and you need to get their stamp to open your restaurant, along with a whole bunch of other stamps from the electricity and the water and what have you. The lady at this sanitation committee just would not give us the stamp. And we were thinking, well, do we have to incentivize her in some way, if you know what I mean? No, there wasn't that. She didn't want a bribe. And we had some funny conversations with her. I mean, my manager went in and said to her, well, surely you can give us the license. Our place is spotless. There's a place down the road that keeps a pet monkey in the cafe. And the lady's response was, oh, wow, how fascinating. I need to go and see the monkey. She's the head of the sanitation committee, and she thinks it's fascinating that another cafe has a monkey living. So you're dealing with this kind of...
she just didn't like you.
Well, this is the funny thing. One day we sent our driver to pick up a document from her, and she said, why haven't you opened your cafe? She didn't want a bribe. She didn't want anything. One day she decided, open it. And she kind of announced it in that way to our driver. So you're dealing with all this. It's almost impossible to explain. If you wanted that license in Paris or London, you'd have to go through certain stages.
Yeah.
You'd have to do certain things. Tick, tick, tick. Here's your license. Yeah. In other countries, it might be a bribe. In Russia, it was neither of those. It was just some...
The ether.
Something happens. Anyway, so I built this cafe. It was the first, well, probably not the first risky thing I did, but it's the first time I really took my money, put it on the table, and took a risk. I could have lost all that money if we didn't get that stamp from that lady.
People usually do lose their money on those types of...
Correct.
Yeah.
But it turned out to be an incredible investment. I got that 60,000 I put in, I'd made back in 10 months. And after that time, it was a matter of profit share with the management. It was an incredible investment. And one of the things that happened because of this, and in life, one thing often leads to another. The Icelanders I've just mentioned came to my cafe and said, Stephen, we like the fact that you're a chartered accountant, that you're English, that you've worked for KPMG and Price Waterhouse and Credit Suisse First Boston. But what we like just as much is that you're in your 20s and you've had the guts to build this cafe, which, by the way, we love.
Yeah.
And that's how I got the job as the CFO of a drinks company, later became a brewery. At the time, when it was just a drinks company, the turnover was 30 million. So it's a small term. It's a medium-sized entity.
Yeah.
And the next 5 years, it was a case of, they'd said to me, we need to raise $25 million. They asked me, have you ever written a business plan? Have you ever raised money? Of course, I nodded, but in reality, I hadn't. So it's a matter of learning as you go along.
Yeah.
So I went away and I learned how to, of course, yes, I knew how to put the accounts together. I knew how to get them audited. I engaged auditors and I worked with them. And then I wrote this 100-page business plan and the financial projections for the next 5 years. And I started knocking on the doors in the city of London. And at first you knock on the wrong doors.
Yeah.
And then eventually somebody said, well, have you tried approaching private equity? To which my answer, age 29, is, well, can you describe what private equity means?
Really?
So you're learning as you go along.
Yeah.
And then I knocked on the right doors and I found some guys called the Capital Group, who are an enormous global financial institution. They manage probably $2 trillion globally. But they had an emerging markets private equity group. And I met two wonderful guys, an American guy called Bill and an Australian guy called Ashley. I pitched to them, and the Australian guy, Ashley, just said, right, stop shopping this around. We're taking the 25 million. They just loved the pitch. They liked the team. They liked the idea. They liked Russia at the time. And they just said, we'll take the whole 25 million. Obviously, they don't sign a check the next day. There is due diligence that they have to do. But 6 to 9 months later, we raised the 25 million from the Capital Group, and then we basically got down to building a brewery. And it was a time in Russia where, when I first moved to Russia, the consumption of beer was about 18 litres per person per year. And the consumption of vodka, believe it or not, by volume, was about 19 litres of vodka per person per year. So you had a situation where you have a country that drinks hard spirits. Part of the reason for that was that there wasn't good beer in Soviet times. There was something called Zhigolovskaya, which was terrible beer. So what there was a market for was a good quality lager beer. So we built our brewery, and the initial capacity of the brewery was 1 million hectolitres. That's 100 million litres, which is a decent-sized brewery. Okay. And we produced this quality lager beer called Bochkarov. The problem was that on day one, we realized we'd made a mistake. We built a brewery which wasn't big enough. So the line of trucks outside our brewery, this is March 99, was a mile long. I kid you not. We had sold the beer for the next 6 months. So immediately, so we'd raised 25 million. We then had to go back out there, raise another 30 million in equity and about 20 million in debt. And we set about immediately tripling the capacity of the brewery to 3 million hectolitres, which is 300 million litres. Then, fast forward another year, we had the same problem. And we realised that 3 million hectolitres wasn't enough. So we ended up, over a period of 3 years of building, this was a constant construction period. Over here is a construction period. Over here is trying to run a business and sell beer. Two things going on simultaneously.
Yes, raise money. Yeah.
Absolutely. So constantly, for those 5 years, I was constantly out there, doing all the normal accounting, getting the IAS accounts done and audited and all of that, and quarterly accounts and board meetings and all of that jazz, but constantly raising money. Yeah. So we raised in total about, let's say, $60 million in equity in 3 finance raisings and about $100 million in debt. And over that period.
That was in the 90s?
Yes.
That's a lot more money now.
Correct. So we started in 98, and in 2002 is when we actually sold the brewery. The interesting thing was, during that period, we were the fastest growing brewery in the world. Nobody else went from zero. So we sold our first pint in March 99. 3 years later, we were doing 3.5 million hectolitres of brewing. So that is like 700 million pints. There isn't a brewery in the world that grew that much. And one of the problems, interestingly, when I was going to London or Paris or wherever to try and pitch the brewery, and I was coming out with, of course, with true numbers, with true volume numbers and what have you, and projections, people at times, especially the brewing people, they just said, no, that's fiction. It's impossible, number one, to build a brewery for that cost, because when you look at the numbers, building a 5 million hectolitre brewery, most people in the know would say that costs 500 million. We did that for a fraction of that because we used a lot of second-hand equipment, a lot of the fermentation tanks and what have you. They're stainless steel. You don't have to buy them new from Germany. You can buy up old breweries, take the tanks and put them in it, sometimes at a tenth the cost. When it comes to the filling lines, a lot of the time you should buy new equipment, because that's very complex equipment. Right. So I'd be in these meetings and the brewing people would be shaking their heads and saying, first of all, no, you can't do it that cheaply. And number two, we don't believe that you've gone from nothing to 3 million hectolitres in 3 years. But we had. So it was an incredible story. And for those 5 years, it was, I was stuck at a computer, running my numbers, writing my pitches. I was, to some extent, yes, I was a CFO, but I felt like being a salesman. Right. Because there was always a constant flow of investment bankers, right, but also trade people. From a very early stage, we had people knocking on our door, like Heineken, like South African breweries, like Interbrew, as it was then called, knocking on our door and saying, guys, we're very interested in maybe buying your brewery at some point. And eventually, in 2001, 2002, we hired investment bankers, Merrill Lynch, and we sold the brewery. And Heineken bought us for $350 million. So it was an incredible story. And at the time, okay, that in the sort of global context, that's now not a very large number. But at the time, in February 2002, when the deal was announced, it amazed people. It was front page news. It was in the Financial Times in London, front page news in Russia, that you could do something like that you could do a private equity transaction of that nature in that period of time. Yeah. So a lot of people learned a lot from what we'd done. I studied theology.
Yes, so yes. The history of financial products. I'm not really familiar with. I'm very familiar with The Idiot. Not very familiar with like exactly how private equity came about. Honestly, it's relatively new.
Yes, it is, and like I've said, private equity is now something. I invest in private equity.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of work recently for private equity funds. I've worked as a non-executive director. And obviously, it's all about having a company that you want to grow fast and eventually exit.
Yeah.
So the likes of the Capital Group and Blackstone and others, they want to invest in companies that they know will grow, and they'll put in a chunk of change, and over 5 years they might want to triple or more their money. So this is exactly what happened with the Capital Group. They put in $31 million, and when they sold out 2.5 years later, they took out over 90 million. So they did what is called a 3x. Yeah. And that for them, that's a good investment. That's very good IRR. But meanwhile, I was learning about private equity, about raising, about how to raise equity funds. I was also dealing with a consortium of Russian banks, many of which were foreign banks with branches in Russia. So it was a massive learning curve.
Yeah.
And I was when we sold to Heineken, and it was a wonderful moment for me because I'd got shares in the business. So on that day in February 2002, age 33, I got a large check. So I got to the point when I decided, age 33, that to some extent, I can leave the rat race, that, I don't need to do the 9-to-5 thing anymore, which was a beautiful moment for me personally.
Yeah, no, it must have been nice.
Yes,
maybe one day.
It's everyone's dream. Well, it's not every.